Hi everyone, welcome to this blog post video. A few days ago, I participated in a Nintex Ask the Experts webinar with my colleague Brad Orlak. We had a bunch of questions submitted before the webinar, and one of the really interesting ones was around having a workflow that would assign tasks to users. When that workflow was to run, they wanted that workflow to look at a particular SharePoint list that had a number of approvers in it, and they wanted the workflow not to go through one of those users or in order. They wanted to randomly pick one of those approvers. So as with all sort of workflow scenarios, there's probably a number of different ways you could do it. I've picked one way that I found to be the easiest for me to do. What I showed in the actual webinar, and you'll see a link in the in this blog post to that webinar, is that I showed a workflow that did that. During the webinar, I actually mentioned that, well, this is a great piece of functionality that you could reuse and put it into a user-defined action, which is what this post is about. What you see before you is this user-defined action that I've called GetRandomValueUsingSQLUDA. First of all, what we'll do is we'll actually go into the parameters and show you what parameters we have. Collection of data is a collection and it's an input parameter, so that's going to contain all the data that we want to look through. So if it's a number of approvers, let's say you have 5 approvers, this is what's going to hold those. Then we have an output parameter that is text, and it's called random value. So that's once the user-defined action actually runs, it's going to store its result in this random value parameter. Now, you can see it's not an overly complicated user-defined action. It's only 3 actions, but what it really comes down to is it's not really a matter of how complex the user-defined action is. It also comes down to if your colleagues are trying to build workflows and they happen to need this sort of functionality, they're going to have to spend time to figure out how to build that out. Maybe they won't even think about putting it into a user-defined action. They'll just build it into a workflow. Then you have another of one of your colleagues who needs to do something similar, and they do the same thing. So all of a sudden, you're doubling up, tripling up on work. You're not reusing any functionality. You're not sharing anything, but you're creating more work for your colleagues. This is a way of actually sharing out some of this functionality so that any number of users can actually use this in their workflow designs. The other good thing is, if you do this one way and you find a better way of doing it, you can simply update this user-defined action, republish it, it'll republish all those workflows that use it, and they'll automatically inherit your new functionality and maybe a better way of getting your random number or your random value. So let's take a look at what this workflow UDA actually does. First of all, we have a collection operation action. I'll open this up. This is looking at the collection of data that we've received. We're doing a count, and we're storing the count in a variable called num_count_approvers. So this is just a number of values in this collection that was passed into us from a workflow. Our next action is an execute SQL action. Now, this is really just a way for me to get a random number because there's no random number in Nintex workflow. I have built an inline function, a custom inline function to do random numbers, but the way that I see it in this particular blog post is that I want to make this a solution that requires no code. So doing this execute SQL action, we're connecting to a SQL Server, we're putting in some credentials, and we're running this simple query. The query itself is simply doing a select statement. We're running a SQL function called rand, which is what gives you a random number between 0 and 1, and we're multiplying it by the number of approvers or number of values in that collection that we've been passed in, and we store that into a number variable called random approver index. So just an index that's we're going to use into that collection. The one thing to note when we're looking at this particular configuration of this action is that I have a workflow constant called DB connection string that specifies where the SQL Server is, what database and also we want to connect to, and also what credentials we want to use. This is quite important because if you download this user-defined action and you want to import it into your environment, you'll most likely not have workflow constants with these names. So make sure you either create them, or if you already have a connection string and some credentials constants in your environment, simply click on, so for the credentials, you can click on this lock, select your credential constant. Same with that button over here to insert your database connection string constant. I highly recommend that you use constant rather than hard coding these in, because if you want to move this UDA to another environment, you'll have to go and tweak the actual UDA rather than just simply creating or modifying existing constants. And the final action that we have here is another collection operation. This one is again looking at that collection of data that was passed into us from the workflow. This time we're doing a get. We're using that index that we just generated from that random number, and then we're pulling out the value at that position in the collection variable and storing that in the random number or random value parameter. Now that we have our user-defined action, let's jump to the workflow that's actually utilizing this UDA. So we'll jump over here, and you can see there's my get random value using SQL user-defined action. If I open this up, you can see I'm actually putting in my collection variable, and I'm storing the random value into another variable called text random approver. But in order to call this, I need to have a collection variable that has data in it. So just before this action, I have a query list action. And in this case, I'm actually querying a list called approvers. There's no filter. I want all the data. I'm not sorting or anything, and I'm simply getting back the approver field and storing it in that collection variable. And finally, just to see what value I actually get, I'm logging that to the workflow history. So if I jump to my actual list, and what I'll do here is I'll go into quick edit mode and I'll create some records. Now my workflow runs every time I create an item. So we'll create 10 of them. 10. We will jump back to normal view mode, and you can see all the workflows. They're very quick. They've ran the workflow and the user-defined action. And if I go into each one of these, you'll see my index is 1, and it's pulled out Brett C. I'll go to the next one. My index is 0. I've pulled out Eden S. Go to the third one. We're doing Brett again. Fourth one. Oh, we're doing Brett. Doesn't look all that random, but there you see index 4, Dan P. And you can see it's quite random in the data that it's pulling out. So hopefully this is a helpful user-defined action for you. I've made the user-defined actions and the workflows available for download at the bottom of this blog post. So feel free to download them. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, feel free to add them to the bottom of this blog post in the comments section. Again, thanks for listening in, and look forward to posting some more in the future.